Rieccoci su nonsoloanima.tv. Oggi ci troviamo al convegno l'eredità dell'antico Egitto e con noi Robert Shoch. Shoch. Thank you, Robert, to be here with us. Just a few questions about your competence. So, why the necessity of doing a convention on ancient Egypt today?
The traditional view of Egypt, in many ways, for people that haven't been following the recent advancements, really dates back over 100 years. A 19th century view, especially developed by some of the French and English Egyptologists, who really saw Egypt as a very primitive society. They made tremendous structures in some cases, but the basis for them making it, there was sort of this European view that they really didn't know that much. They weren't that sophisticated. Somehow they made these interesting structures like pyramids and temples, but there wasn't really a lot of deep philosophical or scientific knowledge behind it. And what we're finding is that's really changed. They have a very different culture than we did, but no less sophisticated. In fact, many cases maybe much more sophisticated, especially on what I would call a philosophical, spiritual, religious basis. They had different priorities than we do.
What is the inheritance, the message that this so ancient civilization wanted to give to the modern man?
In many ways, I think when we look at these ancient civilizations like Egypt, we see that there are different ways to be a human. There are different ways to approach the problems of the world. There are different ways to put your energy into things. And in their case, they were not focusing on sort of a technology in the sense of mass production and the sense of producing cheap goods. They were really putting a lot of energy into, should we say, deeper philosophical principles. Arguably, one message that we get from Egypt is you have a civilization, a culture that survived intact for over 3,000 years. You look at earliest Egyptian dynastic civilization, you look at the latest aspects of dynastic civilization, there were a lot of changes, but this was a civilization that was able to survive with continuity for thousands and thousands of years. And since that, we've had civilizations come and go. They don't last anywhere closely as long.
And who built the Sphinx? And what are your conclusions in relation to it?
Traditional Egyptologists say that the Sphinx was built by the pharaoh Khafra, 2500 BC. Most have thought that it was the likeness of Khafra on this body of the lion. My geological research, and my expertise is geology, that's where I come from. I have a PhD in geology and geophysics. And by analyzing the weathering of the Sphinx, by looking at subsurface features around the Sphinx and doing just, years of detailed investigations, I've come to the conclusion that what I call the core body of the Sphinx, the oldest portion of the Sphinx, dates back thousands of years earlier, at least 5000 BC, before dynastic times. It was later taken over by the dynastic Egyptians, 2500 BC. The head was recarved, so it's a dynastic head. And they used and reused this tremendous sculpture, but the original sculpture goes back much, much earlier. My guess, and it's an educated guess, is that originally it was a lion. And it may have, a lot of people point out that maybe it points to the constellation Leo in the sky, but that's extrapolation really at this. And what's interesting is it's not just the Sphinx, but to carve the body of the Sphinx, they had to cut out huge multi-ton blocks that weigh thousands and thousands of tons, and they carved those out to free up the body of the Sphinx, and they moved them east in front of the Sphinx and built the Sphinx temple.
Regarding other mysteries, we know that you studied the underwater structure of Yonaguni in Japan. Right. What is it, and can you tell something about it?
Okay. Yonaguni is an underwater structure in Japan, Lots of different people have written about it. I've had the opportunity to go there on 3 different occasions. I made dozens of dives on it, and it's a absolutely tremendous underwater structure. It looks like the side of a step pyramid. It looks like huge, gigantic steps. They look very regular. The problem, and many people have interpreted them as being man-made, being artificial. As a geologist, I went over there, given my interest in ancient history and with the Sphinx work pushing back the origins of ancient history, I was very excited thinking that maybe it was an absolutely artificial structure that we had underwater at Yonaguni, Japan. And that would help validate the early origins of civilization. On the other hand, I'm a geologist, I'm a scientist. I have to be honest about what I see and what the best interpretation is. My best interpretation is that Yonaguni is fabulous, it's really interesting, but it's primarily natural. What you have is a series of rocks that do tend to break out on vertical planes and horizontal planes. So it tends to break out and weather naturally, giving this very regular structure. So I think that Yonaguni is primarily natural, but, and this is a very important but, there is a lot of evidence on Yonaguni for ancient human habitation. There are definitely carved, they look like big bathtubs, big bowls are carved. There's ancient tombs that are definitely carved. There's been skeletal material. There's been some tools that have been found. So there's a lot of evidence for human habitation. And what I believe is happening is that you've got a natural structure that's, we look at it today and we think it's incredible. I think ancient people back then thought it looked incredible and they were attracted to it. I think they utilized it. They lived there. They may have even modified it a little bit. My analogy is in Europe, in different parts of Europe, you have cave paintings. We know that the paintings in the cave are by ancient humans. The caves themselves are natural. I think it's very similar on Yonaguni. The major structure, as a geologist, I believe, is natural, but there's clear evidence of human habitation there. So it's a very exciting site anyway.
And where does your theory's precondition take origin from? Behind your studies, did you at the same time had personal experience, contacts of some kind, vision or disclosure, revelation?
Okay, if I understand the question correctly, I've long been interested in ancient history, in our origins. When I was in college as an undergraduate, I studied anthropology as well as geology. I have degrees in both, and then I went on to get more degrees in geology. So I have a very strong interest all my life in the origins of humanity, what makes us human, history, that type of thing. Studying the ancient structures, I try to be scientific, objective, but in being objective, to me, to really be objective, you have to acknowledge when you're affected by them personally. And I admit that studying the Great Pyramid, studying the Sphinx, they have an impact on you emotionally, psychologically. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because I believe these structures were designed to do that. So I've definitely been impacted by them, but on the other hand, and I don't mean to belittle anyone else, but I don't come to my conclusions because they were channeled to me from outer space or from people that lived in the past. I'm coming to my conclusions purely on the basis of scientific analysis.